How should you structure a back day, otherwise known as a pull day? Well, there are many ways to do it, so I'm not going to argue that my way is the highway. But what I will say is that the framework that I'm about to teach you, I think will help you a lot in terms of your ability to actually think through these things, and just in terms of your particular goals, because many of you probably have slightly different goals, in what order you might want to prioritize things in a back session. And this will also help you if you're someone who maybe doesn't have a back day, maybe you have upper lower days. This will also help you organize the upper days, again, just from a framework and a thought process perspective. So I like to divide the back, the pullers, into 4 major groups, okay? And 2 of the groups contain the lats. Why? Well, because I like to categorize the lats into 2 muscles, really. The first portion of the lats are the upper lats. And these are the ones that run horizontally from the spine, right? So these are the ones that, again, sit higher up, and their fibers kind of splay out in this direction. You know, if my body is here, they kind of splay in this direction. But the lower fibers, which not so coincidentally sit lower on the torso, they run up from the hips and the low ribs and the low spine up to the upper arm. Their fibers are more oriented like this. So I call those ones the vertical ones, and then the horizontal, I wrote horizontally, horizontal ones, the horizontally fibers, the horizontal fibers sit higher up. So you have this sort of fan-shaped splay of the lats, and the horizontal lats are different from the vertical lats. We'll go over with specific exercises how that's the case and what that actually looks like. But the other 2 categories are rear delts, right? Many of you know what the rear delts are. The back portion of the delts, also known as the posterior portion of the delts, which kind of, perform wider type motions, flies, and those kinds of things. But again, we'll go over that in just a second. And then the last portion, I just like to lump as the rest of the upper back. So UB is upper back abbreviation. And these are muscles like the middle traps, the rhomboids, the upper traps. Some might lump the teres major into this group. I did a separate video on the teres major if you're interested in learning more specifically about that muscle. But for now, just staying more broad, these are the 4 major categories. Now, notice that I didn't include erectors. I can do a separate video on erectors if any of you want me to cover that specifically, leave a comment. But for now, these are the pullers, okay? So what do these motions look like and how are they different? And then also, in what order should we do these? Because that's really going to depend on a lot of things that are specific to you and not necessarily me. So if we think about upper lat types of motions, these are motions that are generally going to be more horizontal rows with your arms tighter to your body, right? So anywhere, if your arms are going to kind of pull 90 degrees from your torso or slightly higher, right? That's going to create a path of motion and a resistance direction that's going to be really specific to these fibers, right? And the big thing to remember about the horizontal lats is that they move the shoulder girdle horizontally, meaning that if your whole shoulder girdle, all these bones together, your upper arm, your shoulder blade, and your clavicle, if they're all getting pulled forward, those upper lats are going to be really good at pulling your arms backward, especially when your arms are narrow to your body. The vertical lats have a very similar function, just oriented more upwardly, right? So if the horizontal lats were really good at this kind of a thing, what might you think the vertical lats would be good at? Well, they would be good at kind of a similar thing, except where your arms are maybe getting pulled up like in a shrug, right? Pulling down against that direction. Now, with the vertical lats, you can kind of pull narrow to your body, maybe slightly wider, but in any case, you're basically keeping your arms relatively tighter to your body, a la where those lat fibers originate. And instead of pulling in a forward to backward direction tight, you're just pulling in a upward to downward direction tight. For the rear delts, these are your classic like reverse fly, cable, or machine types of motions. You could also do wide rows, but we'll talk about in a second why that's going to be more specific to these tissues. But for the rear delts, personally speaking, I put the cable type motions, just in my personal experience, at the sort of highest pedestal. And the reason I say that is just because with rear delt type motions, people, in my experience, have had very different experiences with different kinds of motions. So some people will get down on a reverse fly machine and all they'll feel is just traps, like Trap City all day. And sometimes people will set up cables in a similar way to a machine and feel the same thing. But the great part about cables is that not only can you adjust it in a million different ways, adjust your body, but you can also adjust where the cable is heaviest. And that matters a lot when we're trying to train the rear delts. So I really like single arm reverse flies for rear delts because you can make it really, really hard when the rear delt is at a stretch, but without getting too sucked into that. The last category is the sort of rest of the upper back. This is where, again, I'll put things like, the rhomboids, the middle traps, and the upper traps. And again, if you want to include teres major in that, teres major, just by the way, just to get it out of the way, is going to be included in at least these two motions pretty substantially. So whether or not you isolate it is going to really come down to, your subjective appraisal of what you need more of. Okay, but these are the categories, and with this kind of category of motion, of course, the upper traps are quite different from the middle traps in some ways, but I like to do motions for this group that are more like slightly low to high motions. And so, for example, I could be like on a cable row setup, and maybe I'm leaning back and I'm sort of shrugging upward and backward as I pull. And of course, as I mentioned, rear delts will be involved in this, but because you're doing a row type motion, muscles that move the whole shoulder girdle are going to have a little bit bigger of a role to play in that context. So these are the four categories, and not so coincidental, if you're doing a bunch of different kinds of back motions, you're probably doing something that sort of looks like this, just in exercise form, right? So you might be doing some kind of horizontal row, you might be doing some kind of pull down, you might be doing some kind of reverse fly or some kind of shrugging type motion, right? But this creates a little bit more of a clear categorization and a clear picture of what boxes you might want to make sure that you're checking if maybe you're not checking any one of these. So let's say perhaps you're already doing a lot of rows for the upper back, where maybe you're doing like a horizontal thing, but your arms are a little bit wider as opposed to narrow. Well, those motions have a lot of overlap with these lats, but not so much overlap with these lats. Whereas let's say you're someone who just spams pull downs, you're doing 10 sets of pull downs, so all those patterns or all those reps that you're doing are more vertically challenging, right? You're doing a pull down, and so the vertical lats will play a bigger role in those. Well, now all of a sudden maybe you're leaving some gaps to be had or to be filled with some more rowing based motions for the upper lats, and for the rest of the upper back, i.e. again the middle traps and those rhomboids that might really contribute to pulling the shoulder girdle backward in the context of a horizontal row. And the other thing I'd say too is how you order these, I think, matters. Now, does it matter as much as the quality of the individual rep, how much volume you're doing, how much effort you're using? Probably not. Like, I think regardless, if you just standardize an order and you track progress within that standardized order, that's probably the most important thing. But what I would say is it's probably sensible, if you want to get the most out of your training session, to not pick motions that are overlapping super closely one after the other. So for example, I personally wouldn't go lat motion, horizontal row, and then rear delt. What I might do is I might say, okay, I'm going to do my vertical lats first. So that's kind of a pull down type of motion. And what does that really not have a ton of overlap with? Well, something that's the opposite direction. So maybe I start with something that's pulling down, but then I move to something that is sort of more pulling up. Right, so you see how there's not a lot of overlap between pulling up and pulling down. And then after that, since there's a little bit of rear delts involved in this one, maybe I'll go back to this horizontal lat one, and then I'll finish off with some rear delt stuff. Now, context here, and something that's very important to remember, is that this also should largely depend on what your goals are. So for example, if your goals are super rear delt specific, you may want to put this first. If your goals are super lat specific, you just want to bring up your lats, maybe do the bulk of your lat volume, even one after the other, before you even start to worry about rear delts and upper back, if that's a strong point for you. And also keep in mind that there are many, like I basically just described these motions in very general terms, but there are so many different options that sort of sit in between these things, right? So for example, a purely vertical motion and a purely horizontal motion, there could be something in between that, right? In which case you're getting a blend of both of these. So the reason I lay out the categories this way is because these are kind of the extremes. And when you start to think more about this stuff and analyze the exercises you're doing, you're probably going to notice that there's maybe a lot more overlap between variations than you realize. Or perhaps you're doing a lot of motions that are kind of like somewhat of a blend of each of these. Maybe it's not quite like a shrug row type of thing, but maybe more of like a horizontal row that's getting a lot of this and a lot of this simultaneously. And so you can start to think a little bit more clearly in a little bit more of a differentiated way if you understand the extremes of these categories, and then you can start to think in between the lines and say, okay, well, maybe I'm doing an upper lower split and I don't have as much time as I might on a full back day. Maybe I'm going to choose, instead of one motion for either of these separately, I'll choose something in the middle to get a decent blend of both of them. Or perhaps instead of doing a really single arm focused rear delt thing, maybe integrating the rear delts in a 2-arm machine reverse fly with some more upper back might actually be advantageous, because again, you're able to sort of blend these two into one. And so my goal with this video wasn't to say, hey, here's my structure, copy my structure 1, 2, 3, 4, right? But more so to say that these are sort of how I like to conceptualize the categories. And so thinking categorically at first is very helpful, because you create sort of hard lines in the sand, so to speak. But then once you start to apply this stuff to your individual scenario, what you're going to realize pretty quickly is that a lot of this stuff is going to appear more as a spectrum, right? We have to start to read between the lines. So overall, this is kind of the structure. On average, what I'll do, because lats are a huge priority for me, I usually do 3 lat motions. Just again, Ben speaking for Ben. I usually do one of these, and then one in between. And then I'll hit 1 motion for rear delts and 1 motion for an upper back. And I showed many of those videos already throughout the course of this video in terms of what those exercises might look like for these muscle groups. So I hope this helps. If you have any questions about how I like to structure things, please drop them below.